So I want to do a quick kind of midterm review and go over the topics that we're going to be covering for the midterm. From chapter 1, the most important thing is the cost-benefit principle and understanding that you only take an action if the marginal benefit is at least as great as the marginal cost. So we covered a lot of different cost concepts: sunk cost, implicit cost, total cost, average cost, marginal cost. But the most important one is the marginal cost. And so understanding how to calculate marginal cost and marginal benefit is just the most important thing that you're going to take out of this chapter and out of this entire course. So how am I going to test you on that? Well, you're going to have to use a table where it's got either total cost or total benefits, and then you're going to use that information to calculate the marginal cost or marginal benefit, just like you did in your homework. I don't remember which number it was, but there was one question where you had a table that you had to fill in the marginal cost or marginal benefit, and that's very similar to kind of how the exam's going to go. And you use that information to determine what level of an activity someone should pursue. So remember, we're going to keep continuing with an activity as long as the marginal benefit outweighs the marginal cost. And as soon as it doesn't, that's when we're going to stop. And so if the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost, sure, we'll do that because that's greater than or equal. As soon as the marginal cost is greater than the marginal benefit, we will no longer pursue that activity. And so that's the most important stuff out of chapter 1. For chapter 2 is all about opportunity cost. So do you understand productivity and how opportunity cost is what must be given up in order to pursue an activity? And so you know how to calculate opportunity cost using productivity for two different tasks, very similar to the example in the book where it was bicycle repair versus web design. And so you were using those two productivities to calculate the opportunity cost of each task. And that opportunity cost was given in terms of the other task. We also use that information to determine who had comparative advantage. Remember, absolute advantage is just who can do the most in the shortest amount of time. Comparative advantage has to do with opportunity cost and who can do the task with the lowest opportunity cost. And remember, only one person can have comparative advantage in one task. So if someone has comparative advantage in one, that means the other person must have comparative advantage in the other. You also want to use productivity to be able to graph someone's production possibilities curve. And so the PPC is a very important part of chapter 2, and I hope you understand that. You also want to be able to use the slope of the PPC to calculate the opportunity cost. So I don't have to give you their productivities. I could just give you a PPC and ask you to calculate the opportunity cost from the information on that. And so remember, the slope of the PPC is the opportunity cost of whatever good is on the horizontal axis, while 1 over the slope is the opportunity cost of whatever good is on the vertical axis. You also must need to know how the gains from trade work. And so if you remember the example 2.5 in your textbook, when Tom and Susan were deciding who specialized in coffee or in pine nuts, they realized that when they specialized in the good for which they had comparative advantage, that they were able to consume at a point that was outside of either of their individual production possibilities curves. And so understanding that and how specialization leads to gains from trade is also a very important part of chapter 2. Moving on to the first part of chapter 3, we understood supply and demand and how those two curves are created, what they represent, and then understanding the equilibrium, price, and quantity using the supply and demand curves. And so remember, equilibrium is just where supply equals demand, and that equilibrium is really, really stable, and that just market kind of brings itself to equilibrium. Market forces create the equilibrium, and nobody is kind of commanding it or setting their own price. The market just does what it does, and equilibrium sort of results. Remember, equilibrium means something that's stable or is unchanging, and that's what an equilibrium price and quantity is. They're the stable price and quantity that the market has determined. And also, excess supply and excess demand, you need to be able to identify kind of areas of a graph, and if the price is above equilibrium, how much excess supply excess demand will there be? Excess supply. And if the price is below equilibrium, how much excess demand will there be? And understand why excess supply or excess demand can't persist in equilibrium, why market forces will always bring them back up into equilibrium. When the price is below, sellers have a strong incentive to raise their price, and buyers have a strong incentive to bid up the price. And also when the price is above equilibrium and we have excess supply, sellers have a very strong incentive to cut the price. And so the only way that we can have excess supply or excess demand in equilibrium is if there's a price control involved, and that's either a price ceiling or a price floor. And so read up on that because that's going to be covered in the midterm. The second part of chapter 3 was predicting changes in price and quantity. And so really for this, you have to understand the factors that shift the demand curve and the factors that shift the supply curve, and understand how those shifts will impact the equilibrium price and quantity. So for the exam, what I'll do is I'll just give you an event and say, how is this event going to impact the equilibrium price and quantity for a good? So for example, if I said a swarm of locusts swept through the Midwest and ate half of the corn crop, what impact is that going to have on the equilibrium price and quantity? Well, you would have to know that that would not impact demand because that has no impact on buyers' marginal benefit or their reservation price to buy corn. What it does do is it impacts the suppliers. It impacts the people who are going to supply corn. And so what it's going to do is it's going to reduce that supply. And so the supply curve will shift to the left. And we know that when the supply shifts to the left, that's going to cause an increase in the equilibrium price and a decrease in the equilibrium quantity. And so if I just gave you that event, you would have to know that the equilibrium price would go up and the equilibrium quantity would go down. And so that's why I highlighted the 4 simple rules. You really have to understand those and understand the factors that shift the supply and demand curves. For chapter 4 was all about elasticity. You have to understand how to calculate price elasticity of demand. There's 2 different ways to do it. One is the percentage change in quantity divided by the percentage change in price. Using that method, basically, you use that method when I give you 2 prices and 2 different quantities demanded of a good at those 2 different prices. And so if I give you 2 prices and 2 quantities, you have all the information you need to calculate the percentage change. Okay. Also, alternatively, I could just give you a demand curve and say, what's the price elasticity of demand at this point? And so if I ask you that way, if I just give you a demand curve and say, what's the price elasticity at a point, you need to use the formula P over Q times 1 over the slope. And so there's 2 different methods, both requiring or both used when you asked a question a different way. And so I think I asked you both questions on the homework. Just get familiar with those. You also have to understand how elasticity impacts total revenue. So an elastic good or a good that's on the elastic portion of the demand curve, if you increase the price there, that's going to decrease total revenue. Whereas if you're at an inelastic portion of the demand curve, if you increase the price, that's going to have an increase in the total revenue. And so understand the different regions of the demand curve and sort of how they impact total revenue or expenditure in relation to a price change. Also have to understand cross-price elasticity of demand and income elasticity of demand. Don't worry about substitution elasticity. I'm not going to ask you about it on the midterm. But for cross-price elasticity, understand that a positive versus a negative means something different compared to whether it's a substitute or a complement. And also for the income elasticity, the sign, whether it's negative or positive, relates to whether or not it's a normal good or an inferior good. And so that's sort of what's going to be required of you from chapter 4. From chapter 5, this is all about marginal utility and kind of more stuff on demand. And so the real important stuff out of this is applying the rational spending rule. Understanding if I give you the marginal utility and the price for one particular good and the marginal utility and the price for a second good, can you tell me whether or not that person is maximizing their utility? And the only way that they can be maximizing their utility is if the marginal utility per dollar is equal across those 2 goods. If it's not equal, then the person should spend more money on the good for which he gets a higher marginal utility per dollar and less money on the good for which he gets a lower marginal utility per dollar. Okay, you also have to understand individual versus market demand curves. Understand how the market demand curve is derived by just adding up all the different individual demand curves at the different prices. And the last thing you have to know for the midterm is how to calculate consumer surplus by looking at a supply and demand graph. And so that's pretty much it. That's what's going to be on the midterm. Hope you guys study hard, and I hope you guys do really, really well on the midterm. I'm pulling for you. Okay.